go. So when I started a new job about 5 years ago, I had the title instructional designer, and I had to Google what that even was. But on the first day, my boss sent me a blog and said, read this. This is how we do things here. That was not his actual voice. But to this day, this blog is the one essential resource I still refer continuously to and send to anyone it will add value to, as it helps us get the right results as practitioners. This is Cathy Moore's action mapping blog, which someone will pop into the comments for you now, because I know you know all about it. So now let me introduce you a woman who has impacted the lives of so many, helping practitioners be better, and as a result, impacting the lives of their learners positively too. She asks questions like, what do people need to do? Not what do they need to know? Why aren't they doing it now? Do people actually need training on this? And going beyond the question of why to understand what for. Dedicated to saving the world from boring instruction and irrelevant corporate training, Cathy Moore.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. I also love the sign you've got there. Thanks. And thank you everyone in the chat for showing up. I'm looking forward to seeing some liveliness in the chat. And I see that some people have gotten up really early. The dedication is impressive. Thank you so much.
Well, people, this is your time, all right? So it's an intimate experience. We really want you to think of this like 1 hour with Cathy of coaching. It's all about you to meet your needs. So you got to ask your questions in the chat. Now, I want to give you some juices so that we can get those questions. This is a resource where you can see I've got these wonderful notes, but I really want to give you some stimulus so we get some good questions coming through. We have curated some already, which I will be starting with, but here's some ideas for you. So thinking about things, you may have questions that you want to pop into the chat throughout. Performance, not information. My clients are going to resist this, and other concerns. Improving performance, not producing courses. Managing the clients or stakeholders. Reverse engineering content, the kickoff meeting. Goal writing, selling it to Scrooge. Identifying the audience, but they need to know this stuff. Why people aren't doing it now. Skills, knowledge, and motivation as issues, analysis, paralysis, scenario design, activity design, challenging assumptions, and showing, not telling. Now that should be many, many bits of stimulus for you people. We will kick off with our first question from the ones that we've curated already, Cathy. Well, there is a question, which is, I feel like you're going to be the queen of this, obviously. How do I convince a client to make a goal measurable? This question came from Pat. So they think it's enough to measure knowledge and awareness, but yeah, how do we do that?
And it's a very popular question, and it's the question I get most. And it's part of the larger package of how do I stop people from seeing me as a worker in a course factory to seeing me as somebody who will actually improve performance. And so when somebody comes and says, goal, what goal? What do you mean? I think it's important to ask a philosophical question is, how did I get here? Why is this person asking me this question and resisting actually looking at the performance problem? And then we could divide it into two groups. We've got independent designers, freelance designers. If that's you, is there something about your marketing maybe that's suggesting that you design courses? Yeah, come to me for engaging courses. Then of course, people are going to come to you and say, I want a course. I don't want to talk about the problem, but just make this fun course, make it look like this thing that I saw on your site.
Yeah.
So there's nothing wrong with making engaging courses, but if you want to move a little bit more toward performance consulting, which can mean charging more, for example, and it might also be more interesting work, depending on what you consider interesting, then you might want to look at your marketing and your positioning. Are you saying I create engaging courses, or are you saying I solve performance problems? And so that's also, look at your portfolio. I know it's super important for e-learning developers. If you want to be a problem solver in addition, then in your portfolio, you might want to include case studies or longer stories about here's the performance problem that was presented to me and how I helped them figure it out and solve it. So that way you're less likely to get a client that says, oh, I don't want to set a goal. I don't want to talk about the problem, make this course. And then if you're in an organization, then it's less in your control, unfortunately. Your L&D department might be branded as the course factory. They might be the place where people come for their courses, in which case you have to like push from your position up to your boss or whoever determines this thing to help reposition the department as more of a performance improvement place and not, we will obediently create the product that you mistakenly perhaps think you need. I'm going to catch up with the chat. Okay. So that's the basic philosophical question is, how did I get here? Was it something I did? Was there something I did that contributed to me being here? And then we get more into how do I deal with the fact that this client has shown up, for which I have some slides.
Go for it.
Okay, I'm going to share, share screen.
So as you're listening, people, make sure if you get some inspiration or your questions, pop them into the chat. We will be responding to them very shortly.
I think I just shared the wrong thing. Let me try that again. There we go. So when we're preparing, when we're preparing for the fact that we're going to talk with this client. So this is the thinking we do before we talk to them. We ask ourselves, who is this client? They are very likely to say something like this, if this is what we're expecting. Why might somebody say this? In the chat, anybody have ideas? Why would a sensible adult facing problems at work come to you with this belief? Any ideas in the chat? Lack of time. They feel they don't have any time to do an analysis. Why might there be a lack of time? They might be
busy, Cathy.
They might be concerned about cost.
Priorities.
Pressure from above, exactly. They might lack the skills, and I would include in that possibly the analytical and cognitive skills to actually analyze a problem. They are, yeah, and I think that a lot of people in the chat are pointing out all of the pressures that this person is under. It's very easy to say the client is annoying, the client is the enemy. But the client is a human being like you and me, trapped in a certain environment, and they are responding to pressures that they're facing. So yeah, they might have no capacity, they're in pressure. They might have a belief that you cannot add any value, which goes back to how are we positioning ourselves? They might have, as Hannah's saying, the belief that knowledge and information transfer is enough. And in my book, I call that the school mindset. So many of us are trained from birth to believe that inserting knowledge in our head is supposed to somehow improve us. And that continues on into training land. Nyla points out a very common cultural issue. Most people gloss over problems in favor of solutions. We're not going to look at this problem. We just want a solution and now. Ignoring, of course, that solution then will probably not solve the problem. Yeah, and for us, as Emma says, we are in a culture in which people in our job, we're supposed to be order takers. So this is almost like a personal transformation, all about boundary settings and recognizing your personal value and all of that. There's a lot of psychology in this. Leonard points out, they don't know what they don't know. They are in an organization, often in these organizations, the first reaction to a problem is throw training at it, just throw training at it. So they're just, they're in that world and let's throw training at this thing. They don't realize that maybe that's not the solution. So we've got a lot of contributions in the chat. Here's some things that often turn up. Again, this is pressure. I promised to deliver a course. I've already promised my boss, I'm going to make a course. So you can't tell me that I can't have a course. I'll look bad. Or as people were saying, I don't understand the problem myself. And maybe I don't want you to realize that. Very common in a large organization, I don't want to rock the boat by pointing out problems that are actually larger. And this one is the trickiest. If someone looks closely, they might decide that I'm part of the problem. And this might be the case if the manager of a team says my team needs training in whatever. They might be the one that actually needs the development. Yeah, and somebody says in the chat, Emma, the type is very small. They might be afraid of what they might find out. And so we've imagined how they might be thinking, And now we're actually going to talk to them in the famous handoff meeting. And in the handoff, often, traditionally, the client comes with a pile of content and says, turn this into a course. Just like that. What we need to do is to just control their minds, get them to realize, we're not going to talk about your course right now. We're going to talk about your problem. And we're going to do that in a sort of weaselly way. We're not going to agree to create a course, but we are also not going to disagree. Get her to clarify the problem at least a little, and get her to commit to a more in-depth action mapping or analysis meeting. So how do we do that? She says this, I need a course on X. Here's my recommended response. I am happy to help. I'm a helpful person. I'm happy. What kinds of problems have you been having with X? Not why do you need the course? What kind of course? When do you need it? None of that. What kinds of problems have you been having? Often they'll respond with something like this. People are doing these things wrong. Here's the content. Okay, people in the chat, what could we say at this point? What could we say? Especially how could we respond to, here is the content for the course. What's a good response for that? We're being agreeable and we're also not disagreeing. We're not exactly agreeing. It's a tricky thing. Any ideas in the chat? I am handing over content for the course I think you're going to build. What do you say? Yeah, can we first look at what they are why they are doing X and Y wrong? There's that. There's sort of a sort of just kind of sidestep that thing. Tell me more about why they aren't doing this thing. What behavior change do you want to see? And I think Katie is getting more toward what I'm looking for. It's great that you have lots of content. Let's have a chat first about about the problem so I can understand it. I think it's really important. She herself may have created this content. This person may have spent 8 hours on a Sunday creating the perfect PowerPoint slide presentation, thinking that you're going to turn it into a course. So we have to acknowledge that. And that's another trick too, is find out as soon as possible who authored the content, so you know whose ego is involved, who is feeling ownership of it. But I like to say thank you for this content. It will be very helpful. It will help me understand the issue. Not it will help me make a course. It will help me understand the problem. And then as people are saying in the chat, so why are people doing Y and C or whatever, get questions about the performance problem. And then maybe her answer is this. Some of them don't know any better. Others know, but don't care. So they need a course with motivational parts. It should have feature A. She is still stuck in people's heads. She thinks the problem is a lack of knowledge and lack of motivation, and it is your job to deliver both in a course with feature A. How can we respond, first of all, to, I think it should have this feature? What's a good response to that? Again, not agreeing and not disagreeing. What's a sort of marshmallowy way way to say that? Any ideas? What data do we have to support that? I think that's the question you're proposing in response to her diagnosis of the problem, maybe. How do you know? Okay, we're getting challenging in the chat. We're sort of challenging our client maybe a little more than might be useful at this point, although it depends on the client. Can you explain how this helps them know or care? Okay, I'm going to say great for the people in the chat to want to push hard on identifying the actual problem. What we have here is an issue, especially if you're an independent. She says, oh, you don't want to create my course? I'll go find somebody else. So I think it's very useful at this point to say, your idea is certainly something we can consider, because down the line, she's about to enter a long process with us. And ideally during this process, she will see for herself that feature A is irrelevant. She'll see the problem more clearly. She'll let go of this idea. and then relentlessly turn it back to the problem, as people are doing. But I would maybe rephrase that as to, how do you know this? And make it more like, I need to make sure I understand the problem you're seeing. What specifically are you seeing? Not like, prove it, but help me understand. Complain to me, unburden yourself. I am here to listen. So yeah, let's see, I'm catching up with the chat. So, and we also have a juicy thing of they need motivation. I highly doubt it, but that's a question for another interview. So in our dealings with the client, we are sounding so helpful. We are sounding like we just want to hear all of their complaints. We want to understand their problem. Please tell me more. I'm so happy to help you. I am willing to consider your ideas. However, I am just obsessed with this problem. And that is what all my questions are going to be about. I am being what I call a relentless marshmallow. I look soft and friendly. Maybe I'm a stale marshmallow though, because when you poke me, I don't give very much. I just keep being soft and friendly until I help you see for yourself what the real problem is and what the real solution would be. And during this conversation, these are the forbidden words. These words have not left my mouth. The client may be saying them, but I do not echo them back. And I also don't say this, because it's way too soon, in the action mapping world at least, to be talking about specific solutions. We are supposed to be talking only about the problem. That's it. That's all we're talking about. So that's it. That's all I had to say about this. So let me stop sharing. And also get rid of this.
So when it comes to, you've got a formula for measuring business goals. I've seen it on your blog. I think quite often we get pushback in terms of, we don't need to measure that, or, oh, no, it's okay. Like, we won't worry about that. How would you encourage people? What specific things could they say to say, no, hold on, let's actually see what we need to measure and change here?
It goes back to learning more about where your client is in the organization, what pressures they're under, how to make them look good. You want to make your client look good. Any design service, the goal is not only to serve the learners, obviously, but you need to make your client look good. So there are questions like, it's tricky, but to figure out, how will you benefit when this problem is solved? To make it, what's in it for me? You're selling this thing to them. How will you know that your team's performance has improved? How will you know that our solution has had an effect? That helps to identify a measure. And then when they say, well, we don't need to measure it, identify why they may be resisting this. And one very, very, very common issue in organizations is nobody wants to claim responsibility for anything. So if they say, oh, we don't want to, we're measuring employee engagement and we want to improve employee engagement, but oh God, we can't say in public, we want to improve employee engagement and this product will help do it. No. Okay, first, we're not going to say it in public. The goal is an internal thing for our design and to keep the stakeholders and anybody else involved in the project focused on what we're doing and to get them to kind of let go of the information delivery perspective. But also, if they're so resistant to even in private saying, we are going to increase this thing, we can massage the wording to, our project will help increase engagement, contribute toward an increase in engagement, blah, blah, blah. So we have the weasel wording again. But the main thing is to show our commitment to actually having a measurable impact and to help them see the benefit to themselves as well. And another important question to ask is there an initiative currently regarding this problem? Like, is there an organization-wide initiative to improve engagement, blah, blah, blah. Then we just say, we're hitching our wagon to that horse, or the other way around, I don't know how that works, and saying, yes, we are joining that initiative with this project.
Cool.
And we're going to
do
it this way.
Okay, so we're going to go to the chat soon for your questions. I've got one more predetermined question that's come from Terry. And the question is, how do you apply action mapping to soft skills? So something like communication or leadership. What are your tips, Cathy?
The there's a couple of very important things. The first is to make sure that the audience is specific. And that template for setting a goal, it's this thing we're measuring will increase by a certain amount by a certain date as people in a specific group do something. So with soft skills, we have two issues. First, that group really does have to be specific. A lot of people think since it's we want to improve communication, all employees will improve communication. It's like, no, because different employees are in different situations with different challenges, and we want to first make sure we understand why we're having issues in communication and what specifically are those issues.
Yeah.
So we need to have a specific focus audience, and the other half of that statement, people in a specific group do something. What is that something if we're talking about like leadership, communication? So the quick solution to that is to have a model. Often they come to you saying, we want our managers to use the everybody's a winner negotiation model, or the grow motivational model, or the whatever model of whatever. That's your quick and easy solution to this, because the model comes with, they should do this, they should do that, and they should do this, and yay, we're done. We'll just kind of
it's a Band-Aid.
Connect that to this organization after an analysis. We may have, by saying as they use this model, we may be jumping to a conclusion. We may think if all our managers learn the GROW model, then employee engagement will improve or whatever. Once we get into analyzing the symptoms of the problem, we may discover that it has nothing to do with even the managers. We may even change the audience. So this is a first attempt, consider it a first draft of what people need to do. If there is no model, then you get to have quality time with your subject matter expert. I would vote for 2 or 3 subject matter experts in this case, because this is a sign that nobody knows what they want people to do. So then there's quite a huge project of identifying what actually do we want people to do? What do we want them to do to improve communication or whatever? What specifically, so we can get some sort of list.
Yeah. And I think that question, what specifically, that goes from communication or like even empathy to communication to like open-ended questions, and you can go down and just keep asking what specifically, and it gets you down that little rabbit hole, I guess.
And then, yeah, and if people are saying they need to understand the importance of good communication, they need to define communication. I love those. They need to define this term and do that. You can gently, you don't reject it, but you say, okay, how can we tell looking at Bob and Martha? Martha can define this term and Bob cannot. What do they do differently on the job? How can I tell looking at what they're doing? So, or more common is understand the importance of this thing. Okay, Martha understands it and Bob does not. How can I tell by looking at how they interact with clients or whatever we're dealing with? So then that starts getting them to identify actual visible objective behaviors.
Yeah, I always frame it in terms of, if I was a fly on the wall, what would I see someone do? And that reminds me of your action mapping all the time. And the language I use with clients, because like they don't know your language or terminology, but they get the fly on the wall, and I get them to name the fly. So Hannah, I'll call out now. Have you got questions from the audience that they would like to know from Cathy?
I do. So we have a question from Sophie. Sophie says, I'd be interested to know why you've added workshop to the list of words you shouldn't say.
Ooh.
Because all of those words, the forbidden words, are solutions. We haven't identified the problem yet. We have to understand what the problem is and what the people need in their jobs. And before we can identify any solution, even training as a solution. I know that probably for freelancers, this is not what you want to hear, that a client would come to you and you'd say, oh, you don't need me, go away. But in the internal L&D department, they need to have that power out of respect for their organization. The organization says, you know, we need training for this thing. And you say, let's look at this thing first before we decide if there's any training solution at all, because there's all these other solutions that we can find as we analyze the problem.
So would you go in for just the analysis? So you'd go in and say, I'm just going to understand the problem first. And that would be your engagement as a consultant. And then out of that, we might be able to look at what comes next.
That's, I don't design stuff for people anymore. That is the approach that I hear people using, where they say, first we'll have like even a set fee possibly for the initial consultation. Let's talk about your problem. Let's identify potential solutions. And then, because they're so impressed with your analysis skills and your consideration for their needs and everything, then they engage you for developing the solution. And that also puts you in the position, because there's often more than one solution. There may be job aids. There may be a workshop. Maybe a face-to-face thing is actually better than e-learning for this audience. Or maybe there's some self-paced e-learning with a face-to-face with whatever. That puts you in the position of hiring subcontractors or becoming, a queen of a little world, where you say, okay, I have a client who needs a facilitated workshop, and Charlie is really great at this, and we need this and we need that.
Cool. Hannah, I'll throw back. What are the audience wanting to know?
Emma would like to know, what marshmallowy questions could I ask to establish if this is a cultural issue? What is getting the client to realize this?
I have a flow chart. So ideally, in the handoff conversation, we are getting a very basic idea of what the problem might be. Often then, we set up a much longer meeting, a 2-hour meeting maybe, to happen a little bit later. And in the gap between the initial handoff and that longer meeting, we feverishly research the problem on the internet. So she says, for example, our nurses need to improve their bedside manner. Okay, the problem is the nurses, they're being mean. And you accept that statement of the problem as a draft, and you go and you research it, and you discover through your research that often this is not something that training the nurses will help. It's often a cultural issue or an environmental issue. They're not given enough time, they're not given enough respect, whatever. That prepares you for this kickoff meeting. And you take out this flow chart that I have. There are other flow charts out there too that have similar approaches, but basically once you've broken down, for example, what specifically you want the nurses to do, you ask, what makes this difficult? You take that question through this flow chart, and one of the branches, the first question you ask, is there something in the environment that makes it hard for nurses to spend 20 minutes talking in great depth with every patient? Is there something in the environment that might be affecting that? And they go, well, yeah, they don't have very much time, and there's a lot of noise, and you might ask, is there something in the way, is there any sort of common belief in your organization, or an attitude about the nurses' work, or a common belief among the nurses and you get to use your position as an outsider to ask the dumb questions. If I were a nurse, I'd feel a lot of pressure, and I don't know, how's your turnover rate with nurses? Do they quit a lot? You start asking these, I'm so curious and I want to help you, questions that you can gently uncover the cultural issue. And ideally, you save a lot of time doing that. Like one memorable client I had, I immediately sent them down this branch. They immediately recognized it as, well, this is a cultural issue. They thought they needed ethics training, but what they needed was training for an entirely different audience because it was a cultural issue. So I would use the flow chart and I would keep asking my outsider questions. Don't let them talk about knowledge and skills first. Talk about the context in which people are working and what comes up with that. I hope that helped.
Yeah, of course. It's like my mind's going to explode with all this knowledge. But then I have to apply it afterwards. So what action will I take? Hannah, I'll ask for one more question, then we'll go back to our curated questions. Is there anything else from the audience that they're burning to know right now?
We have lots of questions from the audience. There's a lot of excitement.
Let's do it.
You're amazing, Cathy, by the way. Just going to throw that in there. I am a big fan. We have a question here from Shirlene. So Shirlene says, do you think this approach of trying to push to understand the why or problem would work for every client? Or is this the time where we decide if they are the right client or not for us?
Ooh. That is a very good question. And it's part of the whole psychological thing that I mentioned at the beginning. if you want to position yourself as I solve problems, and you get a lot of satisfaction out of solving problems, and you get a client that says, I don't want to talk about my problem, doctor, just give me antibiotics now. If ideally you're in the economic position to say, let me recommend to you somebody else. It sounds like we're not a good fit. I have a different approach, or blah, blah, blah. In your marketing, it would be really important to say, here's how you work with me. First, we have this initial consultation with a flat fee where we talk about your problem, we clarify what's causing it, and we identify the barriers and possible solutions. Then, if we decide to go ahead, then we can, develop solutions, et cetera. And that makes sure that we're developing the solutions that will work. So if in your marketing you make that clear, ideally you won't get somebody saying, no, let's skip that thing and just make a course that looks like this. But yeah, when I was starting out and I was doing consulting, writing courses and stuff, I lived in a trailer, okay? Most people don't know this. I bought a trailer that cost $3,000 and I lived in it for 8 years in the woods, off the grid, sort of, not off the electrical grid, but growing my own food and everything, which meant my expenses were extremely low. I said no so much to so many people so that I would not hate my work. And everything about my life has really been to design my life to exclude what I don't like and aim myself toward what I do. So yeah, say no to the client, basically, in a nice way. Refer them to somebody.
That's really cool. That's really cool. Do you want to, Cathy, do you want to go to the questions that are in the live audience, keep going with them, or would you like to go to anything else you want to share at this point?
I think that's up to you. I'm catching up here in the chat.
I reckon, Hannah, let's go to the live audience. So what other questions do they want to know?
Can I knock out this, the question from Shiraz right away?
Yeah, go for it.
Who asked, what if your client is a university selling educational products? Would the action mapping process still be useful? My answer is a quick, probably not. Because for two reasons. They are a university, so educational organizations are usually not a good fit as a client for this process. Plus, they're selling off-the-shelf education as well. Also not a good fit because it's such an important aspect is to analyze what it is that people need to do, what are the barriers to doing it. And if we're selling to a very broad audience who is not necessarily going to do anything because they're studying to pass a test, usually. If they're selling educational products, there's usually some sort of test. So then no, that I would say, no, save your time and frustration, sell them engaging courses, engaging information presentations, but don't try to walk them through the action mapping path.
Yeah. You're a big
experience.
You're a big advocate for obviously performance change, getting results. So if people want to market themselves that way because they do want to work on projects where they can apply action mapping, what kind of language are they using? Not we sell courses, but what would be on their website? What's the framing?
We improve performance. I would, speaking as a person who worked in marketing for a while, I would identify what keywords people are searching for who want to solve problems at work. So if they're looking for e-learning developer, they may not be your audience. So look at how you've, the keywords that you've used in your site. And that's a good question. what keywords would people be searching for? And it may vary depending on your region, if you're regionally specific. And also it may depend if you decide to focus on a niche, which is also another thing you might want to do. Like for a while, I considered focusing only on healthcare because they're sort of impervious to economic turmoil and because they have interesting issues. I always like how that works. So if you have a niche, then maybe you can talk about, improving performance, reducing errors in whatever your niche is. But it would require a little bit of market research to find out what are people looking for. But yeah, it would not be, get your cheap engaging course here because that would not attract. And when I was doing this too, I had a homemade website. I am not a graphic designer, obviously. I hired somebody to design a professional site for me. And that right away got rid of the cheap people. They didn't even contact me anymore because they saw a site that had value and they thought, oh, okay, she probably charges more than I want to pay. And they just move along without even bothering me. Yeah, so marketing is just as much about excluding people as attracting the good ones.
Yeah. And I think it's key, look at who your audience is. If it's like a HR manager, you could go to find out the job searches, because then you know the things that they're supposed to be doing as their KPIs. That's where you can get those keywords that Cathy is talking about. Then you pop into Google Keyword Planner, and that's how you get what she's saying in terms of that language that you want to be using.
Yeah, you want keywords that several people are searching for and that there's not a lot of direct competition for.
Yeah, there you go. Hannah, what else is happening? What do people want to know?
Sophie says, I've often thought learning objectives are part of the problem. They often focus on knowledge, explain, describe, define, etc. I've been trying to create a culture of performance objectives instead. What's your approach to writing learning objectives?
I even have like an allergic reaction to the phrase learning objective because they come from the education world. A lot of what we do comes from education, and that doesn't make it bad, but it does make it, as Hannah has pointed out, a bad fit for corporate training. We want to change what people do, not just what they know. And learning objectives come from a world in which we put information in people's heads and we do a test to see if it's still there in 20 minutes. So when it's inevitable that people on the project will come up with learning objectives, like they need to define this term, they need to put the steps of the process in order, they need to identify this, they need to explain this, explain the widget transmogrification process. We are trying to see if they have this knowledge in their head. So I would let these things come out during the brainstorming. What do they need to do? Oh, they need to be able to explain this term or explain this concept, or, they have to know the steps of the process. And you put it in the action map, if you're doing that, in the information bit. So we want people to be able to explain the process. Okay, what do they do on the job though? Do they actually turn to their colleague and explain the process, or what are they doing with it? Oh, they're doing the process in the right order. Oh, is that a problem? Are they skipping steps? Are they, whatever. So we don't reject when they say it, but we say, okay, what does that look like on the job? And we put that explain the process in non-learning objective language as information they need to know, the process, the steps in which they are to be done. So when I do an action map, my actions are in green and the information is in blue. So that would be a little blue thing on the map supporting the action of actually complete the process in the right steps. So I hope that made sense. So I do reject them, but I don't reject them. I'm a marshmallow. I say, oh, that's interesting. What, does that support?
That's
so
cool.
that they don't get nervous about their important knowledge not being covered.
Okay, I want to, people at home and at work maybe, and in your bed, because it's all global timeframes, get your pens and papers ready for this one. Because I think we still get asked, from clients, we want to lock the screens. It's important that they interact with everything and they need to know everything. So Cathy, what do we say to push back and influence differently?
I don't hear that anymore because people don't come to me with that idea because they know that violence might ensue. I would want to understand why they want that. First, it comes from the belief that our job is to present information because they want to force people to see this information. So it's a position of fear. They're worried about covering a posterior somewhere. They're worried that people will say, oh, you didn't cover this important information, therefore we got sued. It could be that big of a scary thing to them. So we can think about where does that come from? And if it is from a legitimate fear about, compliance or whatever, we can find a workaround where, we send them a PDF of the rules and they get checked off as, yes, they have received the PDF, and they check off, yes, I've read that PDF. Okay, done. But locking the screen to make sure that they are engaged that is such an affront to everything we know about adults and how we function in the world. And I'm a recent convert to self-determination theory. Self-determination theory, people look it up if you don't know it yet. There is research supporting that our motivation depends on our feelings of autonomy, competence, and relatedness. If you give me a little screen and you don't let me, like an adult, say, okay, I've read it. You are taking away both my autonomy, and you are making me feel like you think that I'm incompetent, that I'm a child, that I'm an idiot. So every time we are designing an activity, I think it's very helpful to think about how might this affect the learner's autonomy and competence in particular. A lot of us are doing self-paced e-learning, so relatedness is a little trickier. But yeah, and now that I've seen the light, I see violations of this principle everywhere I look in training, because again, we come from that school mindset, and it happens to the best designers as well, because we think, okay, I have to help people do this thing, and the assumption becomes their minds are blank, or they need to be held, their hands need to be held, and that's not true. We need to ideally have some contact with the learners, which has come up in the chat. Ideally, we can have a focus group with the learners. We can actually talk to them. When I worked as a human being on site, I would go to the learners myself, and I would look at, for example, the Post-it notes that they had on their monitors. That gives you ideas for job aids. Yeah. And I even could accompany somebody as she has an upset person on the phone, plus she's supposed to answer this email, and this other thing is happening at the same time. And I'm going, okay. So that's my long answer.
Great answer. Great answer. And I see that working, everything you've said there, really applicable to when people want a 10 question quiz that is mandatory and they need to get 100%. Again, I'd say that's fear-based. So the answer that Cathy's just given for locking the next button, and anyone that wants to make sure that there's an assessment in there for a compliance course, probably a similar answer. Would you want to expand on that, or?
I think if it's a compliance course and we can't do anything about it, then we have the quiz. Ideally, we write the quiz not in terms of knowledge, but in terms of little mini scenarios. Present this challenge. Can you make the right decision? Because that's what compliance is about. It's not about the knowledge. It's about people obeying the rules. So here, can you make a decision in this situation that follows the rules? Okay, and they make their decision, and we assess that. But I think if you have somebody who's saying you have to lock every screen because of whatever control freak issue they have, then we can point to the research from self-determination theory, the research that says if you control people too much, they lose their motivation. Do we want our learners to be motivated? Let them be grown-ups.
I like it. Hannah, what's happening? What do people want to know? Next question, please.
Okay, so we have a question from Alice. Alice says, I'm in a role where it's hard to get direct feedback from my learners and the learner group is large. Have you seen any interesting feedback mechanisms for larger organizations who may not have direct access to their learners?
That's a really good question. And I would argue forcefully for access to the learners during the design and even during the problem analysis part, as well as doing something that often it's happening more as people get more into agile design. But when I started, we had our interpretation of ADDIE was, briefly analyze it, not really, design it, implement it, throw it out there, we're done. And then we get feedback at the end. So now, we're getting more into prototypes. And so I would try to encourage the learners to participate, if possible, in the analysis of the problem, respond to a prototype of one type of activity, and then also keep them involved throughout. But how do we do that if there's not, 30,000 of them and they're all around the world? When I worked on that Army project that resulted in Haji Kamal and a bunch of other activities, we said we must have a focus group in person of some soldiers. So we actually went to a base. So if possible, if the budget's there, you go to a place where there are some representative learners. I think we had 30, 20 something. It doesn't have to be huge, but ideally representative of the larger population so you can work with them. If it has to be digital, like especially now, one cool thing that I haven't seen people do is when we're identifying what is the problem exactly, what are the barriers, we could use, for example, a branching scenario that everybody goes through, not as a training thing, but as an evaluation, identify the issue thing, where if people are often messing up their interactions with a specific type of client, we say, hey, here's a fictional story in which you're interacting with that specific type of client. And everybody goes through it without being able to go back and make a better choice. And we aggregate all their decisions anonymously. And we say, look at how many people went down this path that we don't want them going down. There's our problem. So there's some of that. There's Survey Monkey, but it would have to be a good survey. And not like, how did you like this? Or what do you think about your manager? It has to be like, we have some idea what the problem is. Let's try to get feedback on it. I'm wandering from the question. Any other feedback mechanisms? Anybody in the chat have any? Because I immediately go to survey type of thing. Everybody does an anonymous branching scenario, so we see how they're making decisions. Anything like that. That's really all I can think of. But I would push for having a focus group, even if it's virtual, get some representative learners.
How do you prototype a scenario like that? Because you wouldn't want to go too hectic with it. So what's like a quick and dirty, let's test this tool that you might use for your prototype?
There's no quick and dirty in scenario land. Just like,
not with
if you're doing a branching scenario, the most vital, important thing is to test the plot, not the finished scenario. Do not invest all your time writing the scenario and then test that. Do a flow chart of the plot, or now that we have Twine, we can create a clickable plot version. But again, we're not writing the whole scenario. We're just saying, okay, client says X. Choices are pushback, agree, blah. And we're not writing out all the details. We're testing the plot. And then we run through that plot with the focus group. And of course, we have to say, okay, here the client says blah, 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 and they look a little upset. And the decision is, and then they say, oh, that's too easy, or that would never happen, or that's how Haji Kamal was born. I wrote the plot and it was too simple. And we got together with our focus group and they said, well, obviously you've never been to Afghanistan, let me tell you. So that's what we did for all of our scenarios in that project. And I think that's the ideal way. So Twine would be the interactive, free, clickable plot, but really I encourage people, do not write the whole scenario yet, because you need to be able to make a very quick change without, you get ownership. You feel ownership, especially when you've invented.
Weren't you? Yeah, like you're going to rip your heart out, like you put.
I have a problem when I create fictional characters. I was on a project for the children's, the K-12 market, and we had some fictional characters, Freddie the Frog and somebody. I really liked them. They had personality. They were clever. They had little snarky comments. And then we used them for like a year, and then the client said, okay, we're going to kill those off and do something else. And I went, what? So if you go to the trouble of writing a scenario, you get attached to it. You feel ownership. And so it's hard to change it when you get feedback saying that's not working. If you just write the plot ideas, you're not getting invested in your characters or anything.
Yeah, nice. Hannah, what else would people like to know?
So Nirad is asking, can you please suggest some books that you recommend in addition to Map It?
I like David Merrill's 6 Principles. Is it the 6 Principles of Instruction? Merrill, Merrill.
Oh, really good, actually.
And he's well before my time, but he says basically the same thing. So that's why I like him. I like people who agree. There is a book called Performance Consulting. I can't remember the authors yet. If you go to my site, I list several books that I recommend. So there's a book specifically on performance consulting. And for those of you, I bet almost everybody in this audience already knows this, Scott McCloud's Making Comics, a big book about how we tell stories graphically, extremely useful for thinking in terms of how do I tell a story visually and concisely.
Very cool. Okay, we're coming close to the end. We have about 5 minutes left. I want people in the chat now to start thinking about what they've learned today and what they're going to put in place. Let's reflect on what you learned, what you're going to put back into the workplace. That's going to be your homework, but that's also our summary for the session. So I encourage you to start doing that now. Hannah, what other questions have we got? I feel like I'm putting you under pressure, but you're doing a great job, audience. Keep it coming.
We have a question from Kate. So Kate says, the action mapping process, tools, questions to overcome objections are great and really help. Are there any other strategies you use for changing mindsets or influencing clients or upwards in tandem with the process?
So tools in addition to like the flowcharts I've got, and
you don't need to go beyond Cathy Moore's stuff. It's so great.
I'm trying to think. Again, I stopped doing consulting a few years ago, and now I'm train the trainer sort of person. I like to point people to marketing a lot because we can learn a lot from marketing. And I think Mike Taylor did a recent blog post or presentation on it.
Yep.
Yeah. And I think that is definitely something we need to look at. And also, like I said, self-determination theory. Mm-hmm. They're very, the people who write about it are very academic, but we can take good ideas from it. What other tools? There are a lot of good tools for getting to the real cause of a problem. I mean, I've got my flowchart, but my flowchart is kind of, it's high level, it's easy. There are much more in-depth flowcharts. And the names of which escape me right now. Piper and Major and Piper. Oh gosh. There are, if you look at root cause analysis, if you look at the fishbone chart, if you just look at identify the root cause of a problem, you find a whole lot of approaches, and they may work better for you than my little, green flowchart. They tend to be more in depth, and they tend to be aimed much at the big organizations.
That's cool. What are, when you worked in the world, like you've kind of moved on a little bit, but in terms of the questions that you always used as your go-to to diagnose problems or influence stakeholders, what were the ones that you repeatedly said that people could use as kind of like a script, or sentences that you used as well, just to help people with scripts of what they can say to influence stakeholders?
It was always, tell me about your problem. Just lots and lots of questions. And a lot of the questions, they come naturally. If you have a natural curiosity to the person who's talking to you, and they say, well, we have this issue with, people are doing X. You don't immediately start thinking, oh, that sounds like, this thing, and I know a good solution for it. You say, tell me more. What does that look like? Is it everybody, or is it just one branch? How is it affecting your performance? How does it affect you personally? What is the pain? I don't say it specifically. I don't say, what is the pain you feel? Tell me. But it's like, I'm picking up on their frustration. They volunteer things. And the more you ask questions, the more they like you. I mean, that was the feedback I used to get, where even if people decided not to work with me, they would say, wow, you really ask, you were the only one that asked a lot of questions. Everybody else was trying to push a solution on me right away. Yeah. So it's really just let your natural curiosity go through and stop. Don't say the forbidden words. Don't volunteer a solution because it's too soon until you're pretty sure. And then yeah, say the word workshop. It's okay.
Very cool. Very cool.
All right.
Okay, so Hannah, what are we seeing? Transfer of learning post this session with Cathy Moore. What are our friends in the audience going to implement, and how have they reflected on this session?
So Emma has said making the client feel like this is a safe space.
Yes, I think that's a very good point.
Yep. Someone's saying, what is your pain point? They really liked that question. And also saying, Kate said, being curious and asking more questions is something that she's learned from this session.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's all that's come through for now.
Cool. Well, there's probably still typing and reflecting, but we are coming to the end. And Cathy, is there any final words of wisdom you want to put out there to the world, to our beautiful audience that have come to see you're their hero? So what would you like to say as your final words?
I want to say thank you to everybody who has come, and thank you to everybody who's watching the recording. And special encouragement for freelancers. I have my own business. It is the best thing in my life. It gives me control. I'm currently in Spain because I can. So if you are unhappy with being the course producer only, and you want to get into more performance consulting, really look at your marketing, look at how you position yourself, because that is under your control. And you can, I see those comments about terrible clients. You can make those people not even contact you. Yeah. You will filter them out. So I really encourage you to do that. I support small business. Go for it.
Brilliant, brilliant. Well, thank you so much. It's been an absolute honor to have you here. You are a big inspiration for the industry, and we're very grateful for the knowledge and value that you've shared today. Everyone, round of applause at home. Thank you.
Thanks everyone for coming.
Yeah,
And
we'll
thank
be
you guys
back
for having me.
shortly for the next session that's coming up very soon.
Cool.